Dr. Shabir Ali, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
It's my pleasure to be on.
Now, Sharia law, is it the boogeyman? Is it something to be afraid of?
No, Sharia is not something to be afraid of. Religious communities generally subscribe to some moral code. And naturally, when societies are organized by believers, they would implement their moral code as not only their social mores and customs, but also in the laws that govern societal behavior more generally.
And I guess we sometimes don't see it because, Christianity influenced the way our laws developed in Canada and the United States, but we don't see it anymore because the religious aspect has kind of died out, but the morals are still there.
Yes, of course. And what has happened with Christianity is that there has been a sort of ambiguous relationship between Christianity and a religion, as a religion, and the laws of the Old Testament. The laws of the Old Testament were clearly given by God, and these were meant to be permanent laws. And to this day, we have Orthodox Jews wanting to abide by those laws and to implement them at all levels of society. Christianity, on the other hand, went in the direction of the Pauline writings in the New Testament, which stress that the salvation is by faith, not by works, not by adherence to the law. And so Christians were largely left wondering, to what extent do we implement the Old Testament law? Some may say, well, we work with just the moral law, but definitely not the cultic laws, laws about how to follow rules within the temple, because the temple does not apply to Christians, and all of its cultic rituals. And then there is a question about the criminal law. What about criminal law and a penal code that is there? Like, for example, if somebody commits this crime, they get this penalty. That's a little ambiguous. If Christians were to set up a society that is governed by Christians, how much of that Old Testament law should apply? This is not so very clear. But Christians have the idea that the will of God should be done on earth. At least this is reflected in the Lord's Prayer, in which a Christian is taught to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So that's a prayer for the kingdom of God to be established here on earth, such that the will of God that is already established in heaven should be established on earth as well. Well, how else is the will of God expressed except in the Old Testament laws which are given? But Christianity did not develop in the direction of having and holding on to secular power. Or a political power. So it was largely a religion that developed within the Roman Empire and under Roman rule. And so Christianity became accustomed to accepting foreign rule rather than the rule of God. Now, the development of Islam has been slightly different, and that's the whole point of my historical description here.
How does Islam compare?
Yes.
How does Sharia compare?
Exactly. So Muslims too, like Christians, have a moral code.
Would it be like the Jewish moral code, more
very,
similar?
Very similar,
Okay.
very similar. And even many of the laws are quite similar. And the difference is that Muslims grew up with an experience, or the religion of Islam developed through an experience for Muslims in which Muslims were the governing power. So seeing the word the governing power, they naturally implemented this moral code in terms of specific laws to govern society and to ensure the fairness and justice and everything that the moral code demands.
So it included criminal law then, and punishment.
Criminal law and punishment and the whole gamut of anything that people will call law to govern society, whether it is private life, social, family, economic, political, all aspects of human existence and behavior.
I think the problem is that Sharia often gets referred to as just the criminal law or the punishment. So when people think of Sharia, they think of, harming people or hurting people.
Yes, and one of the difficulties with this is that Muslim scholarship has not actually interpreted the Sharia in the light of changing and new circumstances and experiences. The world on the whole has moved away from corporal punishment and such physical punishments as were used in past societies. When we think, for example, of capital punishment, we see that many states in the United States still retain capital punishment, but many have now abolished. Most have, and many countries around the world as well. But this is known in Sharia, at least in its classical elaborations. So does this need to be like a permanent law? So Muslims have hardly thought about this, and what has happened in Muslim countries is that there has tended to be some kind of conglomeration of some aspects of classical Sharia law and also like French law or British law or something like this, kind of an amalgam, so that some aspects are governed by classical Sharia law and some aspects by some modern law from other foreign societies. And Muslims in many parts of the world will become accustomed to having their personal life governed by classical Sharia law, but so they will regulate things like marriage and divorce and so on by classical stipulations, whereas many aspects of society will be governed by French law or British law, even in predominantly Muslim societies. And this gives rise to a great level of discontent and uneasiness in the Muslim laity, because the Muslim laity is confused about this. Either you have the whole law or not at all. Like, how do you have this kind of amalgam between the two? And that gives rise to the fever that we notice in some smaller groups and pockets where some young Muslims decide that they need to take over the governing power in society in order to fully implement what they understand to be Sharia law. And in order to prove that they're really serious about this, they will start with some floggings and beheadings and you know, the most grotesque forms of punishment that they could find in classical texts.
Do you think some Muslims are confused about what Sharia is?
Yes, definitely. They think that Sharia is something fixed in history and that must be replicated almost like a McDonald's franchise where you get all the same thing, the same things regardless which location you go into. But Sharia is more dynamic and changing than this. In fact, Sharia is a broad concept and almost an abstract concept. It's more something like the will of God. And it's the path to follow that is an expression of the will of God. But then what exactly is the will of God? This is thought to be expressed in what is called fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. And fiqh means understanding, and that's a human understanding. So there are many different human understandings of the will of God. So there's one Sharia in an abstract sense, that's the will of God that we cannot fully know. And then there is the fiqh, which is the human understanding. Now, that human understanding obviously will not be willy-nilly, but will come through a careful investigation of what the Quran says, because that is an expression of the will of God. It is a careful understanding and study of what is mentioned in Hadith, because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is understood to be a teacher commissioned by God to teach us the will of God. And so that is an expression of the will of God. And it's in putting these two things together, the Quran and the elaboration in Hadith, that one comes to a better understanding. But it's still a human understanding.
Yeah, so it could be fallible, right?
It's fallible.
And it could be changeable as well.
And changeable, and there are many different human understandings. There are many different scholars of jurisprudence who each have their interpretations on various things. So what Muslims need to recognize is that not only is the understanding changeable, but not only is the understanding fallible, but it is also changeable. And it's changeable given time and place and circumstance, to the extent that Imam al-Shafi'i, one of the great jurisprudents of classical history, is known to have had two sets of opinions, one when he was in Baghdad and one when he was in Egypt. And it's only the different circumstances that made him reach different conclusions about things. Now, in our technologically advanced society, especially given the developments within the last 30 years or so with the internet age that we're in, and there are so many new things that really it calls for Muslim scholarship to be very dynamic and responsive to our present circumstances. And that means that the Sharia today would have a much different feel than the Sharia as it was established in our classical history. It's still Sharia, it's still the will of God, and there is still the fiqh or human understanding of the will of God, but the fiqh today, the human understanding today, will be equipped with all of our knowledge of history, our present experience of life with all of its modern developments, and the rulings that will come out of that understanding will be rulings that Muslims will find to be very practical and non-Muslims will find to make sense. It wouldn't be something that they would fear, but something that they would admire, even if they do not decide to embrace it as their own.
Now, given all that you've said about Sharia, is there reason for people to fear Sharia or fear that it will take over in our society?
No. Even if we take the classical definition of Sharia or an understanding of Sharia as a frozen concept, and that's, people may think, okay, that's a barbaric set of laws, you're going to cut hands and stone for adultery and so on. Okay, we don't want that here. But do we have to fear that that's going to happen? No. The Muslim groups who try to implement this in some pockets of civilization or outside of civilization somewhere, they're not meeting with success, largely because they face opposition from fellow Muslims. Most Muslims do not want to govern society with such laws. It's not that they're unfaithful to their laws, it's just that they have a modern consciousness that says that we're not going to stone people for adultery, and we're going to look back carefully at the law, and we're going to find, first of all, that this is not, stoning for adultery is not mentioned in the Quran. So where is this from? Okay, it's from hadith. And was that hadith a pronouncement that was before the Quranic revelation or after? See, there's a question. And a better interpretation is that that must have been done before the Quranic legislation, and once the Quran came to say that it's flogging, then that's the new law. It's not stoning anymore. And then we'll look at the flogging. Are we going to flog people for adultery? In what circumstance? So, like, what would have been the situation in which this ruling would have been applicable? And is that our situation today? Let me make a side comment, and it'll become clearer if we talk about the punishment for stealing. So the punishment for stealing in classical Islamic law is that the hand is cut. But then the jurists offered stipulations. How much should be stolen for it to qualify as a stealing for which the hand would be cut? And then in what circumstance? And it is mentioned that Omar, the second caliph of Islam, at one time suspended the penalty for stealing because it was a period of famine. And he thought, naturally, that people who are stealing are not bad people. They're just driven by the circumstance. So it would be unfair to mete out a harsh punishment in that situation. So he put a moratorium on the punishment. So what about our situation today? Is it a situation in which people are drawn into adultery, in which case it would be unfair to give them a harsh punishment for adultery? So a lot of these things need to be rethought, and not enough thinking has gone into this. People have just simply, in a lazy manner, just said, okay, we're just going to do it the way it's always been done. But if you do it the way it always has been done, you could be misrepresenting God, because what God told you to do in a certain circumstance is not necessarily what He will tell you to do in a different circumstance. In fact, more likely, He will tell you to do something different in the different circumstance. That's what wisdom normally is about putting everything in its right place. In fact, it's defined like that in Muslim tradition.
Thank you. I wish we could do more, but that's all the time we have. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Shabir.
Sure. You're welcome.